Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello again, I'm Frank Mauriello, here with another edition of Colonie Close-Up. Our subject today is the burial ground that was discovered during a sewer project in 2005 on the eastern end of town, right across from the Schuyler Flats Cultural Park. And here with me today to discuss this is our town historian, Kevin Franklin. Also here is Lisa Anderson, curator with the State Museum, and Vanessa Dale, who is a bioarcheologist with the state of New York. And what we'd like to do is I'd like to start with Kevin and ask Kevin give us a little bit of a history, a brief history of the Schuyler Flats area.
Certainly. The Schuyler Flats has been said that it's one of the most important archaeological sites, with the exception of Fort Orange, in upstate New York, related to early colonial Dutch history. The Schuyler Flats, like you say, is located on Route 32 in the town of Colonie, right between the village of Maize and the city of Watervliet. It's on the west side, or on the east side, rather, excuse me, of Broadway, with the originally the Hudson River at its doorstep. A lot of investigation has been done at the Schuyler Flats over the years, primarily archaeological digs that were done by Dr. Paul Huey of the Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation in 1971 through 1974. The Schuyler Flats were originally all part of the estate of the Van Rensselaers, who established a trading port at Fort Orange, which is now Albany. The Schuylers purchased the land from the Van Rensselaers in about 1672, and there was already a farm established there. Arden Van Curler was the first recognized person to have a farm there before he founded Schenectady. So the Schuyler Flats area related to the Dutch goes back to about 1650, and a tremendous amount of history is associated with that site. It's currently owned by the town of Colonie as a cultural park, I think about 11 acres, somewhere around there, that was opened up through a lot of work, particularly, and I have to mention Paul Russell was instrumental with that, did a lot of work, as was my predecessor, Gene Olton, working on that project. The Flats area is commonly referred to as the Flats. Much of the area north of Albany, right up into Watervliet, centuries ago, was known as the Flats.
Okay, now you had mentioned that there was some archaeological work that was done in that area, but apparently the cemetery was never discovered. And just to go back a moment, in 2005 we had a very large sewer project going through that area. And at the time, some human remains were unearthed as they were digging in the area. And the cemetery, we understand, was unmarked. It was not recorded on any documents or anything. And Lisa, could you tell us pretty much what was found there?
Well, they initially impacted one grave in their sewer trench, and they immediately stopped work. This was the town. And they called in archaeologists from Archeological Associates. And what they did was they looked at the path of the construction trench, and they could see in the wall of the trench that there were potentially other graves that were going to be impacted by further construction. So in total, as they looked around, they identified 13 grave shafts. These were the holes that were dug to actually hold the coffins. So that was what they initially found there. 12 of those were right in the path of the construction trench. So those were the ones that they had to remove. And there was one more that was sort of on the outside of the area that was going to be impacted, so that was left in place.
So 13 bodies were discovered at that location, but is it felt that the cemetery maybe actually be larger?
It's very possible. It's a small space. It's a little grassy area that's circumscribed by 2 driveways and Route 32, but it goes back a ways, and there's a tree line, some shrubs, and the museum did a ground penetrating radar survey last spring, and it looks like there are additional graves, other features of some sort out there. So it's very possible. We know there's the one that Harkin identified, and then it's very possible there are others as well. And I think additional survey work like that, where you're not actually disturbing anything, we might be able to find the limits of the cemetery.
Now, are there any plans in the future, Kevin, you may be able to answer this, to mark that site so it's not disturbed in the future?
Yeah, let's step back just a little bit. The cemetery that was discovered was a completely unknown cemetery. The Schuylers had their own cemetery, their own family cemetery plot, not too far away from their house, which is outlined right now with some limestone block that were used on the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal, that were part of the protection of the site itself at the flats. The cemetery. The Schuyler Cemetery, the family cemetery, was removed from the flats in the late 1920s and transferred to the Albany Rural Cemetery. This site, the first discovery of a body of human remains, were in the late 1980s when FedEx was putting in a water line, not associated at all with the sewer line. And at that time, an early burial was discovered, complete with a very crude wooden coffin. And the remains, at that point, were the police departments were called, the Colonie Police Department, the Maine Police Department, State Police, I think, actually had some involvement in it. And they exhumed these remains, and the remains were turned over to the Albany County Coroner. And one thing led to another, and the museum eventually got those remains. This discovery comes years later in 2005, when the town, in working about in the same area, but not exactly in the same spot, but we're working close to that same area, began digging and exhumed more human remains. Again, not associated that we knew of at that time with the Schuyler family, because the Schuyler family graves had been removed and brought to the Albany Rural Cemetery back in the 1920s. So this was an unmarked cemetery. It was not seen on any maps. I've got some copies of maps here of the flats, and the only road that went through that area back in the 16 and the early 1700s, right up to about 1800, was the old military road that ran alongside the river, actually in front of the Schuyler Flats home itself and what was called the Little River. The Waterville Turnpike, which is today's Route 32 Broadway, was surveyed in the very early 1800s, and that road was constructed in about 1830. Again, survey maps of the Waterville Turnpike, and also a survey map of the Troy and Schenectady Turnpike, which happens to show the flats and the old military road, does not show any kind of a road west of the flats itself, which would be today's Broadway. So this cemetery, if you stand down in the flats where the Schuyler home stood, and use your imagination a little bit and take away Route 32 Broadway and all the surrounding homes and whatever, and if you look west, the road rises past where the Erie Canal came in 1823, 1825 through that area, but there's a slight rise in the earth west of the flats itself, and that would have made an ideal spot for burial, and this is where these graves were located.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Now, how were they buried? How were the bodies buried?
They were in wooden coffins, and we've since had some of the wood identified as pine. So very simple. They were different kinds of shapes. Some were hexagonal, some were rectangular, but very simple coffins, no ornamentation of any kind. There were coffin nails associated with it, and those nails are of the type that was being made up until the early 1800s. So they were hand-wrought iron nails. And there were also some small brass pins that were found in the graves, and we think because there were no articles of clothing, no buckles or buttons, anything like that found with the people, we think they were probably buried in shrouds or winding sheets, and these small pins may have been used to fasten those. That's not uncommon in early burials. So as Kevin was saying, the Waterville Turnpike came through in the early 1800s. These artifacts date up to the early 1800s. So what we think is that, or what we thought initially was that these graves probably were either early 1800s or maybe 18th century. They were, fairly old graves.
Before the Waterville Turnpike, and obviously before the Erie Canal.
Yeah.
The survey map for the Waterville Turnpike is in the Albany Hall of Records, and I believe the survey map was done prior to 1810. It says 1800, and then you can't read the last digit, so it's before 1810, and it ends right at about what would be today's Waterville city line, in that vicinity. And the home of Thomas Hillhouse is seen on there. Hillhouse came from Rensselaer County to Albany County in about 1803, I believe. So his house is marked on that survey map. And if you look north of where the Hillhouse home was, and that would have been right at about the entrance to the Albany Rural Cemetery today, if there was some kind of a cemetery, it probably would have had just a small cross on the map as marking a cemetery site. That's not seen. So the earliest map that we have is that I have in my possession is a copy of the 1767 Bleecker map, and again that just shows the military road running in between the Schuyler Flats home and the Little River itself. That map does not show any cemeteries. There wasn't any need to show it on that particular map. But
and we also know, as Kevin mentioned, that the Schuylers first owned that property as early as 1672, and they continued to own it. They had a vast holdings along the flats there. They continued to own the parcel where the burial ground is located up until about 1820. They sold it off in two pieces, one in the 1830s. So they sold them, and there was a house built on one of them. That's the Germain Mansion. I forget what it's called now, but it's very likely that the cemetery was not visible at the time they sold that property and houses were being built. I don't think someone would build a house with a cemetery in the front yard. So
correct.
Our assumption is that it had long since
been abandoned
or become invisible. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for cemeteries to be marked with simple field stones or even maybe wooden markers that could easily, just cease to be recognized as cemetery markers or grave markers.
Now, can we tell who was buried there?
Well, not by the graves, and that was one of the first things that we had to deal with because, as I mentioned, they were very simple wooden coffins, very typical of the 18th century. They were buried in an east-west orientation, which was also very typical. A lot of Christian burials were done this way, but it wasn't strictly limited to Christian style of burials where, you rise to face the east. But it was very typical of 18th and even 17th century burial in North America or in the Northeast. So it wasn't possible to tell who they were by the way they were buried. So that was one of the first questions that we had. And we know, besides the Schuylers, and there were troops that were stationed at the flats, there were Native Americans who lived there, going back thousands of years, but they were also there historically. There was a fort built, or at least a map showing a fort that was built there where there were long houses built inside the fort. So there's plenty of early historic occupation at the Flats, even though it was a very rural area, very much on the frontier outside of colonial Albany. There were a lot of people there in various capacities. So there was nothing about their graves themselves that said who they were. That's where the museum came in, was to look at the remains themselves and try to determine
Now,
who
from
they
the
were.
remains, you were able to determine who these people were?
Well, we first started by looking at trying to tell whether they were, Euro-American, African-American, Native American. That's one of the first things that we do, and that's partially done by looking at the size and shape of the face and the skull, and there's measurements that you can take because people vary sort of across the globe in the way, their appearance, the way their face is shaped. It's a thing that sort of naturally varies, and you can quantify it. It's not a hard science. You can't always be certain, and certainly when people are marrying people from other parts of the world, you can get different kinds of features, but there are statistical ways of looking at somebody and measuring their face and their skull and determining what the place of their ancestry. So in this case, what we were able to do was by looking at several of them, at least several of the adults we determined were of African ancestry. So that started to point us in the direction of who they might be, sort of helped us sort of focus the next questions on what we would look at in terms of our study.
Now, if they were of African ancestry at that time, were they free, or do you know if they were enslaved?
Well, initially we didn't know. There were certainly free blacks in colonial Albany in New York. We knew the Schuylers had a large property, a lot of farming, a lot of industry going on there. They may have had indentured servants, they may have leased property to people, they certainly had slaves. We found a lot of historical evidence that they had slaves, and in fact, that's the only evidence we've found of Africans on their property and in basically the surrounding area of Watervliet and the Flats, is that most of the Africans who were up there were enslaved. So it doesn't mean that there's some record out there that we haven't discovered that says maybe these people were indentured or they were free blacks working for them, but so far everything we've found says that they were probably enslaved.
Now, what's the importance of studying these human remains?
Well, anybody from this period of time, particularly groups that are poorly represented in the historical record, we know so little about. We know so little about their life, what they experienced, about their lifestyle, about what they did day to day, and where they fit in the bigger scheme of things in terms of the development of Albany, the development of New York State. So to be able to tell their story, even in a small way, maybe what they experienced in their own lives, really adds to the history record that, for the most part is written by upper class white guys.
Now, what types of things can be learned by studying the Schuyler Flats people? I know you talk about their activity, their diet, nutrition, so on. What are some of these things that you can be looking at?
Well, one of the first things we did was to look at other cemeteries like this that have been studied. And there was in recent years, there was a very large African cemetery found in New York City that a lot of people are aware of. They've done a tremendous amount of research, and they particularly documented that Africans living in New York City, whether they were free or enslaved, lived a very hard life. So that was one of the first things that we wanted to look at, was what was their quality of life. And because bone is a living tissue, it constantly is remodeling throughout your life. So it responds to things that affect you, like disease stress or nutritional stress or heavy work, things like that. And it can actually retain a certain record of those events. So if you spend a lot of your time doing a certain kind of activity that's very repetitive, very strenuous, it can produce sort of diagnostic marks on your bones that we can look at later and say, this person, you can't say exactly what they were doing, but that they were doing some hard work or they were doing something physically demanding. Just like if someone had suffered from a particular disease that affects your bones, you can kind of read that and say that, maybe later in life they experienced something like this, or maybe they survived something and it's, there's evidence that something affected them, but then it was healed and they went on and they lived a long life. So there's a number of things that your bones can tell you about what you've gone through in life, and that's what we look for.
Now, from those skeletal remains, could you determine whether they were male or female?
Well,
yes. There were 6 women, 1 man, 2 children, and 5 infants. And originally, when the archaeologists were in the field, they knew by the shape and size of the coffins what to expect. Infant bones don't preserve very well, so the infant graves were largely just teeth and a few other bones, very difficult to collect a lot of remains from those graves. Some were later found in the lab, excavated out of big chunks of dirt once they were allowed to dry out. They're very difficult to assign sex to because of the lack of preservation and a number of other reasons in our field where children and infants can't be sexed with confidence, especially when they don't preserve well. But the women and the man definitely had enough, they were preserved very well, and the skull and the pelvis are the two areas that we really look at for that, and they were preserved well enough to get age and sex out of those features.
Yeah, initially we, in looking at who was there, because there were so many children and way more women than men, there's a tendency to want to interpret that. And if you average out all their ages, their average age at death is very young. It's 22 point something years. And that seems startling, but it's actually in keeping with what they found in New York City. What we think now is there are certainly other people that are still buried there, so it's hard to interpret a small number of people like this. If we knew who else was buried there, it might tell us a different kind of story.
So you're actually able to determine the age of the individuals that are buried there.
Absolutely.
And you said the average age was 22.5 years?
Yeah, the youngest adult, the youngest woman was 25 to 35, and the oldest woman was above 50, probably well above 50. It's difficult to tell skeletally how old you are once you reach that age. And then the man was between 40 and 50. The other women were between those age ranges of around 30 to 40, 35, 45. The children were 4 to 6 and 6 to 10 years of age, and the infants were, 2 of them were possibly stillborn or around birth, another one from 3 to 9 months, and or 2 others, and the other one less than 6 months old.
Yeah, the reason that average age is so low is because you include the infants. So there's very high infant mortality, at least in this small sample we're looking at. Once people survive to young adulthood, they did tend to live a little bit older. So I think the average age of the women was 38, something like that. And the man, of course, we only have one.
40 to 50.
Can't average him, but.
Now, from the remains, you can determine what type of activity they did?
Not necessarily the actual occupation, but what parts of their bodies they used most, definitely. And they had very strong muscle development. When you use your muscle, the bone responds to that by building up. Or if you strain your muscle, it actually leaves a lesion in the bone. So we numerically recorded to quantify the level of development and across the entire body. And I was able to see the patterns. Most of their bodies were well developed in the upper body areas, shoulders and arms and elbows, but the hips and legs were also, upper legs were also well developed. The man and one of the 2 oldest women had very, very extreme muscle development, which means they were using those muscles probably until they died. They weren't taking a rest, or there was no atrophy. The bone was extremely well developed. They also had very extreme osteoarthritis in the joints, and that's not only commensurate with age normally, but also with the muscle development. It was showing that they definitely used certain joints more than others. The man had a lot of osteoarthritis in his elbow and shoulders, and a lot of upper body strength, and the women were all over across the board with different parts of their bodies. They even had arthritis in feet and hands. And fingers specifically. So they were doing very specific things with their bodies at any given period of time. And even the earliest woman, 25 to 35, had early onset osteoarthritis. So they were all working very hard their entire lives.
It does look like they were doing slightly different activities.
Yes.
Some of them have different patterns of arthritis and muscle development.
Is it possible to determine what those activities were?
The range of household activities involves so many parts of your body that it would be difficult to say. for instance, if someone were sewing, maybe you could see that through their fingers being very muscular and having osteoarthritis, but activities like gardening or possibly doing the laundry, you use your hands, you would use your upper body. A lot of the hip problems, there was infection in the hips in 3 people, a lot of muscle development and osteoarthritis, but you have to bend over doing many different activities, so what those exactly were would be difficult to say. One woman did have a notch in her front teeth, 2 of her front teeth, and that's very exciting because that's consistent with pulling something very thin through the teeth, something as soft as thread or a grass type of material.
I was going to ask you about their dental condition. What are some of the other dental conditions that you discovered?
Pipe stem wear on some of the women.
And what's that?
And that is, you see round facets in the teeth, an actual circle in the teeth. Clay pipes were common then, and clay is a very hard substance, so it really just can grind the teeth down if you do something habitually. Even as I said with the thread, if you pull something through your teeth often enough, it will leave a mark. And the pipe stem facets were nice and round and obvious, and so that was an activity that they were doing and enjoying. As far as the other parts of their dental health were concerned, it was terrible. Every single adult and one child had very bad cavities. Most of them had almost all of their teeth affected by cavities, and dental calculus, which is like a tartar on the teeth, and abscessing and periodontal disease. So they clearly weren't having much dental care, and many of them had actually lost teeth before they died, and those areas were even well healed, indicating they had lost the teeth well before they died. The oldest woman had lost all of her teeth. She had no teeth whatsoever.
Wow, that's fascinating. Could you tell what infectious diseases they may have had?
They didn't have anything pointing to a specific disease. They showed evidence of generalized infections, which many of us can have. A lot of their infection was very mild, and most of it was well healed. There was only one person who had some active infection throughout her body, and we call that periostitis. It's generalized. You can't point to a certain disease when you see these indicators on the bone, because they're affecting many bones in the body that would normally just show that type of infection if something was in your bloodstream, or if you had a milder infection, you might be able to explain that better. But they showed evidence of that, and some possible anemia deficiency disorders like iron deficiency. 3 people had pitting in their eye orbits that could be indicative of that going on in their childhood. So they did exhibit some childhood stress, but in that regard, they were pretty healthy. They weren't showing signs of a lot of dietary stress. Their dental health and the activity levels were perhaps the worst part of their lives.
So from the remains, you could look at we'll get an idea of their diet, and any clues about the types of food they ate or how it affected their health at all?
I think because of the large number of cavities that they had, we can be pretty sure that they were eating a lot of sugary food, high carbohydrates, and that could be something like maize, some kind of a gruel, something like that, especially if it sticks to your teeth and it's hard to clean from your teeth, or you don't have good oral health care, which nobody did in those days. Mm-hmm. So probably a high carbohydrate diet. We're not doing it, but we've sent out samples from these individuals to have isotope studies done, which will tell us what the proportion, the composition of their diet was in regards to things like maize or meat or fish, that kind of thing.
Now, just for our viewers, explain a little bit about what maize actually is.
Maize is corn, and it was a very common component of the diet. It was especially common among Native Americans. So you see a very similar pattern of a high rate of dental caries, but it was also a big thing that was raised in the colonies, corn and wheat and other kinds of grains like that. And they were a big part of the diet because other sources of foods were sometimes hard to come by. These were things that could be stored, and They were high in calories, so they were pretty much a staple of the diet.
Now, also from the remains, could you tell if there was any type of trauma, if there are any broken bones or anything like that?
Yes, that was also very mild, especially in comparison with the urban cemetery. There was no indication of interpersonal violence or any serious trauma like that. There was one woman with a healed wrist fracture, very well healed, and the man had a broken toe, which was very well healed also, but misaligned. So it probably wasn't said. The oldest woman had very bad osteoporosis, and because of that, her bones were extremely brittle, and she had died while she had 4 broken ribs. They were broken clean through, but healing. So she had been alive for about 2 weeks, roughly, when she died of, she could have died of anything, but the ribs were broken. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that would have to do with violence, because someone that frail could easily break ribs falling or doing something else. So that was about it for trauma.
Now, Lisa, can you tell us, what does this tell us about the people at the Schuyler Flats?
Well, we think so far, based on everything we've looked at, that they are mostly African. They were probably buried sometime in the 18th century. We don't know for sure that they're all of African ancestry, but we think most of them are, and we're having DNA analysis done right now to try to help us verify that for certain. Because of who they are, we think the historic record points to them having been enslaved, very likely by the Schuyler family. A number of their neighbors also had slaves, but the Schuylers owned this particular piece of property, so we think that's who they are. That's our best guess at this point.
Okay, and Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about the physical condition of the remains?
We know they worked very, very hard their entire lives. They had early onset osteoarthritis with the youngest up through the worst arthritis conditions a person can have in the oldest people. They suffered from very poor dental health, but they also were able to enjoy tobacco and smoke pipes, and possibly we learned that one might be a seamstress, and we can see their activity levels through muscle development on their body. And also that we really can't tell you how they died. Very often we can't, but we can tell you what they experienced while they lived and what kind of life they might have lived.
Okay. Now, back at during that time, there was a young lady named Annie Grant that lived with the Schuyler family, and she wrote a book. And Kevin, maybe you can give us a little bit of information about what she wrote in her book and what she told us about that period of time.
Annie Grant is her married name. Her maiden name was McVicker. She was a young girl. Her father was in His Majesty's service with the King of England during the French and Indian War. And Annie Grant stayed with Madame Schuyler at the Flats, and many, many years later she wrote Memoirs of an American Lady. She had returned to Scotland with her father, and in the very early 1800s she wrote her memoirs of her life at the Flats and at the Albany area. And Memoirs of an American Lady is used by many historians, particularly studying that period of time with colonial Dutch and colonial English era of the mid-1700s to the late 1700s. But what's very interesting about Annie Grant's book, it's a very descriptive book, particularly about the Flats. And one of the things that she mentions in her book, there are 2 chapters that are related to the slaves at the Schuyler Flats. And she actually names some of the people. Now, getting back to the earlier thing, what's important to remember in Annie Grant's book is she speaks of gentle treatment of the slaves at the Flats. You have to remember this was through the eyes of a young child at that time. and certainly some of the investigation that the State Museum has done has indicated that, you know, these people had anything other than gentle treatment. They worked very, very hard. But one of the things that's very interesting in Anne Grant's reading is she names the names of the two women who each had children, and this burial that was discovered, this graveyard that was discovered, it's possible that these could either be these people or people that were descendants of these people that were mentioned in the book. There's no exact way of telling that for sure, but it gives a name, perhaps, to some of the faces that the museum has, the reconstruction techniques that they've used on the faces.
In the book, it mentions the names of the two sons of these women, and it seemed like they were very competitive with one another, and so that sort of goes along with the hard work, because one of them was very good at chopping wood, and the other one was good at thrashing wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, they obviously worked very hard.
Those were probably very typical activities for anybody working on a farm in those days, that type of physical labor, just to get produce. The Schuylers were involved as a number of the prominent families in the whole international commerce, so they were producing things at a great rate for them to ship out through the port and around the world.
And these slaves must have been very active in doing this type of work to get this product and produce ready for shipping. Oh, that's fascinating.
And maintaining the household.
Right.
Yes, sure, absolutely.
Right, all the women.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've actually found many records of names of slaves who were owned by various members of the Schuyler family throughout time, and if you look at any given time, there may have been 6 or 7 who are named in one household, so that is probably just some of the ones who were there. So there's a large number of Africans who were enslaved at the flats over the course of 200 years that could be any one of these people or someone else.
Okay. Now, if anyone listening would like some additional information, Kevin, I'll start with you. What is your contact information? How can people contact you to obtain information about the book or additional information about the Schuyler Flats?
They can contact me at the Town of Colonie Historian's Office at 782-2593 or at www.colonie.org/historian. And on there is my email address, which is historian@colonie.org, or franklink@colonie.org.
And Lisa and Vanessa, how can people contact you if they'd like more information about the remains that were found at the site?
They can reach us through the New York State Museum, through the museum's website. My email address is landers6@mail.nyscd.gov, and the phone number is 486-2020.
Okay. And Vanessa?
You can reach me through Lisa. She can handle all of the questions, or my email address is vdale, VDALE, @mail.nyscd.gov.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I thank you for being my guest on Colonie Close-Up. Thank you again for watching our show, and we'll be back soon with another edition of Colonie Close-Up. Thank you.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.